Hey guys, it's Devest. Today I've got another video debunking nuclear energy advocates. This time it's about the idea that we should use nuclear power to complement renewable energy. So the general line goes that renewable energy is intermittent, so we need nuclear power to provide dispatchable energy, which they erroneously call baseload to meet demand. So our current system with majority renewable grids basically consists of using renewables at their maximum capacity and then having dispatchable fossil fuel generation to meet demand when there's a shortfall in renewable electricity production. So the nuclear advocate is saying we should replace fossil fuels with nuclear power in this specific niche. The problem with this is economics. And as a reminder, economics is not just some nonsense numbers. It's a system to measure productivity. So when I am talking about economics, I'm not saying we can't use nuclear power because you would have to print money. It's that the amount of resources and labor you would have to put into the system to get the electricity is too much to be realistic. There are just other ways that make far more sense to replace fossil fuels as a source of dispatchable power on a renewable grid. So the first major problem with nuclear power is that it's not designed to react to demand changes. The term baseload power refers to systems using steam boilers to provide consistent power output: coal, oil, geothermal, and uranium. They don't react well because of the fact they use a working fluid, which has to react to temperature changes. So if you want to increase their power output, they have to increase the heat and then the water or whatever reacts to the heat. It's the same for decreasing output too. You have to wait for it to cool to a new stable temperature, which takes forever because water can soak up so much heat. That's why we use other systems for dispatchable energy. Hydroelectric can change output as fast as they can open or close the gate. Gas turbines generate electricity by using air as a working fluid, and batteries just require the flip of a switch to start pumping out electricity. So this is an engineering challenge that could be solved, but what can't be solved is the economic problem of using nuclear this way. Now, a gas turbine is much cheaper in terms of capital cost to start up compared to a nuclear reactor. And on top of that, the fuel consumption, which can represent up to half of the operational cost of a gas turbine, is decreased to a fraction when you're using gas turbines for dispatchable energy instead of your primary supply. By comparison, most of the cost of a nuclear reactor is up front. Because of the complexity of building and running a reactor, the fuel cost is negligible, about 5% of the total cost, so curtailing production doesn't save you any money. In practical terms, using nuclear for dispatchable energy just means paying the cost for a nuclear reactor and then running it at low capacity factor. So if you took a nuclear reactor at 95% capacity factor, which is already 6 times more expensive than wind or solar, and then you run it at 2% capacity factor to cover for wind and solar, you're now paying the same amount of money, but only producing 1/45th the amount of energy. That is, if you were to use this the way a nuke fan thinks it should be used. You would have your wind, solar, and hydro supplying electricity most of the year because they would be the most economical. Then in order to supply electricity reliably without batteries, you would need to have a fleet of nuclear reactors on standby, enough to supply all of your electricity needs. For that price, literally anything on the planet would work better, including the straw man that nuclear lovers make about how a fully renewable grid would have to operate. Typically, they claim you would have to build a huge overcapacity of wind, solar, and batteries to make it work reliably. It's telling that a nuclear power apologists default to proposing a plan that sounds reasonable at first, but then falls apart if you actually understand how the electrical grid works. Because they don't know what they're talking about and are more interested in being smug and superior than actually fixing the problem of fossil fuels. But also, their proposition isn't even the best model for producing nuclear electricity reliably in the first place. The cheapest way to build out a nuclear electrical grid would be with a combination of nuclear reactors operating at high capacity factors in conjunction with batteries. Since the batteries are a fraction of the cost of nuclear reactors and demand fluctuates throughout the day, you could save money by building fewer nuclear reactors and replacing their capacity with batteries that you charge at night during periods of low electricity demand and discharge during the day when demand is higher. In theory, this would actually make nuclear power cheaper. In places like France, their reactors only run at 70% capacity factor because they have to react to fluctuating demand throughout the day and curtail production when there isn't enough demand. But if there is constant demand, either in the form of direct electrification or storing electricity for later dispatch, then they can operate at max capacity factor, like how nuclear reactors in fossil electrical grids operate. But then you're back to square one because we're supposed to use nuclear to solve the false dilemma of renewable intermittency, which is already solved by energy storage systems like batteries. Also, this still won't make nuclear viable economically or politically like wind and solar, because that is a fundamental problem of the system. In contrast, the reality of how a 100% renewable grid would work would actually be relatively simple and cheap. You would take combined cycle gas turbines and replace the fossil fuels with carbon-neutral fuels. Probably electrofuels, since those are the most energy-efficient form of electricity to liquids and will need the energy density of diesel fuel for things like aviation. This would basically act as a second battery system with a lower round-trip efficiency of about 1/3 of a battery, but greater energy density and timescale to cover for the intermittency of renewables. The infrastructure for the gas turbines would be much cheaper than a nuclear reactor of equivalent capacity. In addition, the battery systems would work to complement gas turbines in the same way as my realistic Nuctopia model. You could use the batteries to provide the flexibility the electrical grid needs to react to demand in lieu of inefficient simple gas turbines, while the slower combined cycle gas turbines make more efficient use of carbon-neutral fuel, further reducing the demand for fuel. Also, nuclear power isn't as weather-independent as you'd think at first. In fact, because of the water requirements, it functions more like hydropower if you're doing it inland. If you don't have enough water or the water is too hot, then you have to curtail electricity production. And if you hook it up to the ocean, then you have to run ultra-high voltage power lines from areas where you can produce electricity to where customers need it, not really any different from what China is doing from bringing their western desert solar to the coastal eastern provinces. And I know transmission lines are another big stickler for nuclear power fans. France got hit by the water needs for nuclear energy in 2022 especially hard because their second largest source of electricity is from hydropower, which also takes a nosedive during a drought, obviously. On the other hand, different renewable energy resources work to complement each other. If you have a drought, then the reduced cloud cover increases solar electricity production, rain means you get more hydropower, and during the autumn and winter wind turbines are more productive. So a shortage of one is typically compensated by another. This happened in 2023 in the American Midwest. They had less wind but more sunlight over the same period. So if you have nuclear on a renewable grid, then you're basically just making an extremely expensive version of hydropower with different terrain requirements. But we have misattributed the reliability of the rain cycle and hydropower with the reliability of uranium and nuclear power. Because the rain cycle is ultimately a product of solar power, along with the wind and sunlight. If it was to stop then, that would mean life would be doomed anyways without food or heat. Thanks for listening. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Until next time, this had been Divest.